Thank you very much. You kindly take your seats, thank you. So in our first series of talks and our first panel, we set the scene, gave you a framework. And now, we're going to ask a question. We're going to ask whether Labour can deliver growth without rebuilding public services. You'll remember that during his autumn statement last week, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, talked about improving productivity in the public sector and introducing reform. We hear that all the time, don't we? Well, okay. Well, let's see what Labour's task will be and how they're going to deliver. For this session, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage, well, they're here already, Hilary Cottam, on my far right, although not politically, I suspect, social entrepreneur and policy advisor. We have Rosie Fogden, who's head of research and analysis at CPP. We have Paul Johnson, director of the IFAs, and Jivon Sander, head of economics at the New Economics Foundation. And Jivon will chair the panel. So, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well,
and please, give them a round of applause. Get them ready. Give them some energy. Yes. That way they'll perform better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to this panel. Yes, I'm Jivon Sander. I'm the head of economics at the New Economics Foundation. On the other side of my life is I'm also the Labour's parliamentary candidate in Loughborough. So look, this is today, of course, what we're discussing is what Labour can do or what it can do to get growth or what it needs to do on the side of public services. Look, in terms of where we sit as a nation, obviously we are going through our worst domestic crisis since 1945, the worst fall in wages since Napoleon threatened these shores, public services that are literally crumbling before our eyes and nowhere near enough house building, and on top of that, the next Labour government will have to undertake what will end up being the largest economic transformation we've ever seen to get to a no-carbon economy. That is a context under which a future Labour government, if elected, will have to govern. So there's no pressure on us then, going forwards. And these challenges, of course, are interlinked. You know, we know that, for example, not having a functioning NHS is why this country is the only one in the OECD to continue to see long-term sickness rise after the pandemic. We know we need to get skills up to insulate 19 million homes and indeed as well install 600,000 heat pumps a year, which is the current government's targeted. And these challenges are worse in more deprived areas. Waiting lists are twice as high in the most deprived areas as the least deprived. And last week on the budget, dealing with that, either our domestic crisis or our future challenges, clearly nowhere near enough and clearly not serious thinking. So this panel today will help us to kind of answer some of the questions, indeed, that future Labour government will need to answer, in particular, how they can achieve lasting growth and how that can happen with rebuilding public services, and not only economic growth, but of course inclusive prosperity across people and places, which we haven't seen a lot of. And we've got a brilliant panel today to discuss that, of course. Hilary Cottam, Rosie Fogden and Paul Johnson, all of whom have been introduced. We'll start off with opening remarks. We'll have a discussion amongst the panel, and then I'll throw it open at the end to an audience Q&A. Hilary, let's start off with you. Labour and public services. What are your thoughts?
Yes, okay, so if the question is, can Labour deliver growth without rebuilding public services? I mean, the answer is no, isn't it? I mean, there's kind of like no need to... But I just want to make 3 points, really, in the kind of 3 minutes I have. So the first is I think it's really important to be clear what we mean by growth. And I think what we're talking about is human flourishing, the kind of possibility of every person and every community in Britain building their capabilities. And being able to do that, so building their capabilities to flourish, but also kind of within planetary boundaries. So we're not talking about, kind of growth of GDP, because we know that GDP alone, we've seen already, does not actually kind of change poverty levels, for example. I mean, we talked in the earlier panel about US GDP growing, but poverty is not shifting. And obviously, GDP growth that kind of further threatens planetary boundaries actually means that we won't survive. So I think we need to kind of talk about growth now in a very specific way. I don't see that in the Labour missions, and that's something we could talk about. But then, so moving on from kind of understanding that growth is actually human and ecological flourishing, it's axiomatic that you need public services in order for humans to flourish. So then I think the question is, what kind of public services do we want a Labour government to deliver? And I think we've got to be really clear that what we don't want is a kind of revival of 20th century services that were designed for a completely different society and economy. So in my book, Radical Help, I set out kind of like what kind of services we need. We need a welfare system that takes care of us cradle to grave. In that way, we absolutely do need to kind of go back to the Beveridge vision. But then we need to think about what sort of welfare support in terms of care and education and so on actually grows our capabilities for this century. So we've got this very industrial system which kind of tries to fix us when we fall apart. It's very vertically integrated. Money and knowledge move up and down in very vertical ways. And we know that all the problems we are trying to kind of sort of engage with today are very horizontal, that they are about building capability and they're about joining communities, professional services together in very horizontal ways. I've only got 3 minutes, so this is very abstract, but what I want to say is that these kinds of services and approaches exist all over Britain. I myself have kind of grown many, but lots of people in this room have probably grown others. We know that they cost less. We know that they enable people to flourish. And I think the role then is rebuilding public services that build on these models. And then the third thing I want to say is that I think we are at a very, very particular point of transition. Particularly kind of services around employment that we've inherited were developed by Beveridge, and he was very unusual. You know, he understood that we were, because of technology, in a time of transition and we needed a different approach. And we are right there again now. We've got kind of 3 big forces. One is technology, changing our work, our families, our communities, how we live, how we sleep. The other is ecological crisis. And the third, I think, is just a growing intolerance of our populations for injustice in every form of place, of race, of gender, which means that we really need to think again. And so what I would say is that Labour needs to think about growth in a new way, about how public services engage with that. But what we need is a very big story about this moment of transition and about what kind of services, what kind of growth, what kind of support do we actually need as citizens to face into this moment, which is very, very different. It's not just about the kind of last years of turmoil of a Conservative government. It is a kind of fundamental, different moment of transition.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Off to... Thank you all very much. Rosie, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to start off by saying that I'm not sure why Labour would kind of want to grow the economy without renewing services, because local and national public services are something that the electorate actually care a lot about. And so you've got this year's British Social Attitude Survey, which revealed that 55% of people think tax and spending should be increased to fund education, health and social benefits, which is quite a lot higher than it's been in the past. And we actually convened a citizens' jury over the summer to feed into our piece on the fiscal framework, and found an 86% of that jury that we convened agreed that the government should be raising taxes to fund public services. So there is this kind of, you know, broad-based agreement across society that public services are really important and that there's an urgent need to fund them, and that government should be doing something about it. But as you heard from Charlotte this morning, when we had our pulse survey, which we carried out a few weeks ago, we found that, you know, people aren't convinced Labour are actually going to make any material difference to their life. So I think it, you know, is really time that Labour started talking about how they're going to deliver growth and grow the economy through public services, because I think that's what people are worried about, and you know, people's concern is really justified. You know, it's 2023 and your train's more likely to be cancelled than in 2015. As you said, Juven, there's 2.6 million people who aren't working due to long-term sickness, and the number of children experiencing destitution has tripled, while the funding for kind of the youth and family services that support them reached its lowest point just before the pandemic. So, you know, it's really clear these big societal problems that we're facing and how kind of deteriorating public services and a lack of local government funding has kind of fed into them. And these conditions just aren't conducive to fair and broad-based growth. So I think, you know, resolving those issues could provide a real boost to the economy that also raises living standards. So, you know, to be clear, from a CPP perspective, we are talking about economic growth and specifically productivity growth. And we published a fair growth productivity model earlier in the year, which demonstrated that policies which look to improve local levels of skills, health and gender employment gaps could generate an additional 160 billion in economic output. So, you know, public services really can deliver growth. And and they're clearly not the only drivers of economic growth. You know, business investment does matter, but at the moment, the data suggests that the state of public services is holding us back, and it will continue to hold us back. It isn't just a problem for right now. Kind of the links between poverty, stress, poor health, those are all really well documented, and that means that there's a risk to, you know, the future workforce, their resilience, their productivity, as well as the current one, by allowing this rise of destitution and child poverty across society. So I think at that systematic level, it's really important that policymakers and politicians in the Labour Party recognise that public services are real enablers of the economy, and they're not just a drain on state resources, because public services are under threat. There was a County Council's network survey that looked at county council spending and how inflation and rising demand are leading to historically high overspends and risks of insolvency. You know, and there are more cuts set to come. In the autumn statement last week, Hunt gave away all of the fiscal headroom created by higher tax receipts as a result of inflation, basically at the expense of departmental budgets, which are now 19 billion worse off in real terms. And that's going to be at the expense of, you know, day-to-day expenditure on transport, prisons, local government, all those kind of things. And anyway, kind of our recent analysis has shown that public spending is going to need to rise just to meet demographic and cost pressure increases. So the fiscal situation is difficult, and higher interest rates are going to make public spending decisions even harder in the coming years. And so Labour does need to be strategic, but I think my main message is that neglecting public services just isn't a long-term strategy for success, and instead Labour need to be focusing on a kind of proactive set of policies that drive productivity and stimulate fair growth. So we've kind of recommend focusing public spending on tackling poor health, extending access to affordable childcare, reducing child poverty, increasing opportunities for disadvantaged children, and gearing the workforce towards net zero. So in terms of economic growth, Labour probably could deliver growth without rebuilding public services, but it wouldn't be broad-based, it wouldn't be sustainable, and also don't think it would really help with re-election in 2030 either.
Thank you very much. And finally on to Paul.
Thank you. Well, let me start with where Rosie got to in the middle of what she was saying about the difficult fiscal situation. And it really is extraordinary where we are at the moment. This Parliament has seen the biggest tax rises of any Parliament in history. And and that's not because this is a government that loves tax rises, that's because I think we have reached a point in history where they became inevitable. And I think they will stay at this highest level in history, probably for the rest of my life. And this is quite remarkable because they've actually been very stable for a very long time at 33% or so of national income, gone up to 37% of national income. Why is that? Well, it's a combination of much bigger debt interest payments, and they're going to be with us for a while. And that's one reason why we've got high tax, and it feels like there's not much money for public services, because we're spending 2% of national income more on debt interest than we were 4 years ago. That's the entire defence budget on just the increase in debt interest. Secondly, as you've heard, because of demographic change, we're continuing to spend more on health, and we will be spending more on pensions into the future. If you look at public service spending, health was a quarter of it back in 2000. It's about 40% now. If you believe any of the numbers in the autumn statement, it'll be 45% by the end of the decade, and that's squeezing out other things. We've stopped cutting defence spending, which funded the welfare state for a very long time. So I think we need to start from the assumption that taxes are going to stay higher than they have been through any of our lifetimes. And that, of course, creates other problems, because if that's the case, how acceptable are further tax rises going to be to fund public services? And I think that's something that is a political decision or political question we may find the answer out to. Second part of this fiscal issue is that if you take at all seriously, and it's a question of whether you should, the numbers in the autumn statement last week, they imply cuts. across most areas of public services over the next 5 years. Now, that's not a prediction from me, but that is a bit of arithmetic that comes out of the numbers in the autumn statement because of the squeeze on public spending going forward, related exactly to what Rosie was saying about the use of about tax cuts essentially being paid for by cuts in projected public spending. So that is obviously on top of what was a period in the 2010s of remarkable cuts in public services. Although this Parliament is an outlier, this Parliament spending has gone up quite significantly. In terms of the relationship between these things and growth, there are clearly some clear relationships. One is about infrastructure and investment spending. Now, that's due to be cut really sharply over the next 5 years. In the budget books, it's flat cash for 5 years. That's obviously a big cut over that period. We know that's bad for growth. If you're looking specifically at other areas of public services and growth, we know that education is desperately important here, and we know the bit where we're really failing, which is further and vocational education post-16. And that's where, if we're really focused on growth, we're absolutely going to need to focus. More broadly, where we are is we know that justice, prisons, local government, social care, and so on are very, very squeezed indeed at the moment. Can we grow without those? Yes, we can, but we're not. That's not necessarily a kind of growth, as Hilary was saying, we might want. I mean, to some extent, whilst I take Hilary's point about the kind of growth that we want, we do need GDP growth in order to achieve anything. I think that's really very clear from all of history, and I don't think the next 10 or 20 years is going to be different from that. Without overall income growth, we will end up with no progress for the poor, with intergenerational inequality crystallising, with those who have wealth doing better than those who don't, because you can't catch up if the income of the country isn't growing. The last thing I'd say is that there are international examples out there of all sorts of sizes of state, types of public service, and different levels of growth. Absolutely, we can have a bigger state and higher taxes and high growth if that's what we want. That's what a lot of Western Europe has. France has massively higher taxes and public services than we do, and higher productivity. But we can also choose to go the other way. There are countries in the world with high levels of growth and poorer public services. These are big decisions. But whichever way we go, we need to get the structure of these things right. We know, actually, how to get more growth, whether that be through reforming planning or reforming the tax system or infrastructure spending or the education system. We actually choose, or indeed trade with Europe, we choose not to do that. And whatever government we have next time, I think, has to choose growth, because without growth, we're not going to get the improvements in public services that we're talking about. Finally, since Hilary advertised her book, please read mine. Follow the Money, it's called, and it's got all the answers in there.
There we go. Not one but two books to buy after this panel for everyone here today. And it's great to see that everyone on this panel is getting paid, apart from, I think, myself and Rosie. So there we go. Good to hear that. Well, I think the first thing to say is, look, there seems to be at least some consensus here that public services are important to get economic growth, that it is the foundation of our prosperity. And the question I want to open to the panel now is, why has this discussion not been happening for the past decades? Why did it take us to get to this point in time? And I mean that from both a narrative and a forecast sense. When we were having those cuts in the early 2010s, we weren't then having a discussion on the other side, it seemed. I was quite young then, right? I mean, I didn't have a beard then, I didn't have grey hairs then, I was young. We didn't have this discussion. And in the forecast sense as well, I mean, Paul, I've been watching the IFS for years and years and years. I don't think I saw that come out. So my question is, if we now here accept that public services are important for growth, why are we only discussing this now? I mean, I'm not sure who wants to start. Maybe if we start Hilary and then throw it open.
Well, as somebody who's been working on public service for about 30 years, I think we have had this conversation. And I think that a lot of people have been talking about how public services are an investment, not an expenditure. And I think what happened actually in the pandemic was you suddenly saw, for example, the Financial Times, who would have put them in the expenditure column, start to talk about them as an investment. But I think the other thing is that this is social infrastructure. And what happens, I mean, Kirsten talked about this kind of, in the Bradford case, is that you can sort of just about surf along for a while on kind of infrastructure you've already invested in, but there is a point at which it gets so threadbare you can't go any further. So, I mean, I don't agree that we haven't been talking about this, and I think there's been a lot of pressure. But I do think, one of the things is a geographic divide. I mean, my work is in post-industrial places, and things are really, really ragged. I think you can sit in Westminster and be a civil servant in Westminster and really be quite oblivious to kind of most of what's going on, which is probably why the kind of actual innovation has been in post-industrial places. It has been in local government, not in central government. But I think this is really important. And can I just say something about, I mean, earlier, CPP, you showed a place where, in post-industrial places, where there is kind of growth and productivity, blah, blah. But I think what's really important about that is that in those places where I work, if I take Barrow as an example, I mean, we know that Barrow is going to be a place of immense growth because that is where the defence spending is going right now. Does it touch local populations? No, it doesn't, because what's happened is that there aren't the skills in Barrow. BAE have built a Hilton hotel, and if you have a job above 50,000, you go there Monday to Thursday, and then you leave because you don't see, I mean, there are actually brilliant schools in Barrow, but there's a kind of perception that you don't have brilliant schools in Barrow, so there's not kind of good enough learning. There's definitely not good enough skills, as Paul was talking about, so you can't grow the population. There's a total crisis in care, which is not at all particular to Barrow, it's kind of national. But, you won't take a job if you can't kind of keep your mobile phone to worry about your child in school, or if you're kind of worried about your parents. So all of these things underpin people's, not just at the macro level. I don't disagree with you that incomes need to go up, but paying carers, a GDP would be a way for, which is how I would say, pay carers, GDP will go up. But the thing is that we've got to kind of invest in that infrastructure, and we've got to see that at the micro level, people won't go to work unless that infrastructure is there, and at the macro level, our country can't flourish, and we can't take those things apart.
Absolutely. I think this local element is really important, and part of what Hilary was saying is terribly important. When you're thinking about levelling up and you're thinking about getting better jobs into areas, that can often be bad news actually for the poorer population or the less skilled population there, because it can just push rents and house prices up in the area. So you do need a strategy which takes account of that, which is either building new houses or reskilling people at the same time. I mean, this relationship between public services and growth has been, I think, known for a long time. We absolutely know what the relationship between education and growth is. If there's one thing that worries me about, post-COVID world, is we know that we've lost a generation to some extent in terms of the education they've gotten, and particularly children from poorer backgrounds who have suffered really badly from that, and I think we'll be suffering from that for the longer term. And I just wanted to sort of say a little bit more about that element of things. Some people, of course, in the UK are doing absolutely fine. A large number of people are doing absolutely fine. But there is a large group who aren't, and they are very much those who are poor, have low levels of education, and you see them suffering throughout, whether it be missing school, being caught up in the justice system, being ill through their lives. We know that a 30-year-old with poor level of education has worse health than a 60-year-old with a high level of education. They're much more likely to be on disability benefits at 30 than a highly educated 60-year-old. And that's just one example of the way in which we have very different experiences across the country which are related to the effectiveness or not of Sure Start, which has largely been got rid of. Actually, this government has grown spending on childcare, but entirely for people on relatively decent incomes and in work, and not at all. Indeed, there are fewer poorer kids in high-quality childcare than there were. We know that in the education system, those from poorer backgrounds do worse, though that's not necessarily the education system's fault. As I was saying, the experience of COVID tells us they're not in the education system, it's even worse. So we need to invest through that. And the lack of support, the lack of success of people from poorer backgrounds, in particular with low levels of education in the labour market, is one of the big problems that we face. And so if you want growth, you need to bring that part of the population with us, and that requires some of the investments both in helping people into work, in their health, in their education that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think so. Something that's relevant is some research that we did earlier this year looking at social determinants, like the social and economic determinants of health. And educational disadvantage is the biggest social or economic predictor of life expectancy across places. So, it has a huge impact if you can't access education and training the same as other places. You don't live for as long and you're not in as good health, which is huge, really. So yeah, I think that spending definitely does need to happen. A lot of what we think about at CPP is how investment in communities can benefit the whole community, because that's really kind of our mantra of inclusive and fair growth is about everyone being able to participate in that economy and benefit from it. Otherwise, you just get a two-tier society. We actually did a piece a few years ago on kind of the role of businesses within place, and it's a really hard thing to put your finger on, because a lot of businesses can be international, multinational. Like what is their role and responsibilities within a particular community, really? So I think that's an interesting question, and something that I know that is much more of a kind of live topic of policy debate in devolved areas in government. Our Inclusive Growth Network held a conference on good work with Manchester Metropolitan University earlier this year as well. So I think that is something that devolved governments are thinking of, how we bring in businesses and think about anchor networks. But I think it's a big joint effort, basically, across the public and private sector.
Yeah, that's really. I want to pick up, like, devolution's come up a few times, centralization's come up a few times. Like, in a previous world, I worked in the Treasury, and it is bonkers the way that we do governance in this country, basically, that like 400 odd civil servants decide how to spend £600 billion in cash. There's a reason why infrastructure spend is great in London and great getting from London to elsewhere, and not very good connecting up places elsewhere in the country within like the Midlands or the North or the Northwest or wherever else. My question is that we talk a lot about devolution, and obviously Labour have committed to taking back control. What is it you'd like to see specifically in the devolution piece, and also specifically how it interact with public services? So how can devolution, and how should it be designed to improve public service delivery?
So something that we've called for recently in the devolution space is for 2% of income tax to be devolved to the highest tier of local government, with a kind of certain percentage of that, I think 40% maybe, redistributed towards places with weaker economies, and also some of that set aside for capacity building as well. So, really building in the redistribution element, but transferring a lot more spending control basically over to local governments, so that they can start to, and something we have called for many times over many years, is consolidated funding, single pots that local governments with the right accountability in place and combined authorities can spend across services, because these things are joined up and interrelated. I think that's where the benefit comes in. So we see that as a big part.
That is really helpful. And Paul, maybe also about the funding of local government, what it should look like in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a separation here between our local government structures we have at the moment and an ideal devolution system. I'm fairly convinced that devolving additional spending and tax powers would be helpful for growth, and I also think that one of the reasons that we've got the level of inequality we have between regions at the moment is to do with this degree of centralisation in Whitehall. I can't prove it, but I think the evidence there is pretty convincing. But I do think we need to think about the level at which we do this. Is the answer to devolve a lot of this to district councils? No. Is it to do it even to county councils? Probably not. We probably ought to be looking at regional levels, the sort of 9 regions of England. I mean, that would be how most other countries think about devolving serious economic policy making and powers to parts of their country. And that, of course, then slams straight into the power of local authorities and local identity and so on. So that's difficult, but I do think we need to think about that. In terms of funding local government, it's a disgrace the way that it works at the moment. It's not been properly reformed for decades. The cuts have been bigger in those areas which get more money from central government, which is another way of saying those that are poorer and more metropolitan over the last 14 years. And we are still basing it, to some extent, on data which is now a decade or more out of date, despite the fact that despite the fact we have more up-to-date information. The so-called Fair Funding Review, which is supposed to update all of this, is being pushed past the next election. And when it comes to reforming this, it's going to be incredibly hard, because on any rational basis, you're going to be redistributing really quite significantly. In other words, there are going to be winners and losers. Now, this is something that all governments have kicked into the long grass. It's obviously easier to do this when there's money around, but both on the sort of finance, the amount of money that local authorities get, we've got it wrong, and of course in the way that we raise money through council tax, which we know is regressive, where the sort of average council tax as a fraction of property value in Hartlepool is about 100 times higher than it is in Westminster. There really is no sense in the way that we, no, 10 times, sorry, not 100 times. There really is no sense in the way that we raise local taxes either.
I mean, I can say three things about this, I think. I mean, one is exactly to the point that Paul is talking. I mean, I think, how does funding work? And the previous panel talked about this as well in very strong ways. So we know that sort of the way that kind of local taxation is working, business taxes, the Green Book and all of this, needs reform. I mean, why? I mean, we should then have a discussion about why these things are talked about decade after decade and don't happen. But the other thing I think is about sort of devolution to people, to citizens, because if we think about what the public service challenges are now in the 21st century compared to when our welfare systems were designed, there is almost nothing that we can do now that will make a difference that doesn't embrace citizens and get citizens active, whether it's kind of thinking differently about how we embrace education and particularly kind of skills education, whether it's thinking about care, health and well-being. These are not things that can be done well by a leader, if it's a local government leader that commands their population to do something. Take exercise, we heard about diabetes in the kind of previous section. These are about new systems that embrace everybody, and that is a different mindset about, I mean, people used to talk about double devolution, didn't they? And that's kind of something that I think we need to bring back. Just kind of going to another layer of the administration is not really going to what's going to kind of transform public services in this country in the way that we know works. And to that point, and my kind of third point about this is that I don't know what is the word that is the opposite of devolution, up to the centre. What would we call that? I don't know. I guess centralisation. But what I'm thinking about is a flow of information, which is that I think it's really striking that when I first started working in the 90s on public service reform in this country, all the energy, the ideas, the imagination, the innovation was at the centre. And now it really isn't there. It is in the regions, it is in local government, it is in communities, and it's almost a rule that the further you go from London, the better you will find in terms of kind of innovation, in terms of public services that actually kind of work with the community, for the community, always on an absolute shoestring. So I think also what we need in terms of the kind of core of this conversation, which is about public services, is a way to somehow move that learning from the micro back to the centre, so that we can understand what are the stories, there isn't going to be money, but what are the stories that will change things? I mean, one example that I've got is that, I don't know how long ago now, kind of in the early 2000s, I started something called Circle, which was a way that we could build in communities for older people to take care of one another. And we built it to 10,000 people. We had very, very good independent evaluations of it. Hospital readmissions go down, people kind of live better, all the rest of it. When we started, we had a list of local authorities that wanted a circle that were entirely Labour local authorities, because this was perceived to be a kind of very left-wing idea. David Cameron came to power in 2009, and he talked about how brilliant circles were, because he had kind of heard about circles. Overnight, we had 100, sort of inquiries from different levels of kind of Tory local government administrations who wanted a surplus. So it is about kind of understanding what will enable the kind of public services we need to move in a time of kind of fiscal kind of deficit. And a lot of that is about storytelling and understanding what will open the floodgates to allow what is working to kind of grow, rather than have to kind of keep working around the outsides because the kind of, the centre is kind of trying to do things in different ways.
That's really helpful. Thank you. We've only got like 6 minutes or so until we open up to questions. So I think the final thing I want to ask the panel before I do go to the floor is that obviously, look, the next Labour government, if elected, will have to deal with the domestic crisis, will have to deal with crumbling public services. We're talking today about public services and what it means for growth. For you three, what is, do you think, the priority areas, given the fact that not everything can be done? If we go kind of, I suppose, in reverse order, so if Hilary, you'd like to kick us off, what do you think is like the key thing or key things that Labour should be looking and focusing on if they are elected next year?
Care and education. Care because my work is in communities and people feel fundamentally, deeply uncared for. So I mean that at every level, like how you care for your municipal workers, how you care for your older people, how you knit together something that is kind of owned by people, not, a kind of new NHS for the 1950s, but a different way of thinking about care and education, because our education at every level is utterly out of step with what we're facing into in terms of kind of technology and ecology. We are going to have to change our work and in fundamentally different ways, and our education systems are just not geared for it.
Paul?
Well, I think one priority would be the sort of governance change that we just discussed. So that doesn't necessarily cost a lot, but actually pushing decisions out of Whitehall, I really do think is an important part of any programme. Within education, I would say specifically, as I indicated earlier, post-16 education, and particularly for those not going on to university. That is, it remains and has been for a long time in this country both very poor. The choices available if you're not going through A-levels are difficult, and we know that a tiny fraction of our young people go on to higher levels of vocational qualifications, and that's within education. I would absolutely focus on that.
So I think, Labour have talked a lot about prevention, and I think if they're serious about that, they need a much stronger focus on early years education and child poverty as well as on health. And I think, as we've just discussed, a new funding deal for local government at every level is a really important part of that. And then I think on the skills side, I think transition to net zero is obviously really important, and I think that we could be directing a lot of funding into making sure that local populations are able to upskill and reskill and actually get the benefit of that net zero transition and investment that needs to happen.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, now, guys, up to you. So I'll take questions in banks of 3. Can I have this woman on the front row here? The red T-shirt over there. And there's someone on this side as well. I can see their hand up. I think the young man over there as well. So I'll take questions in 3. Yeah, just here on the second row, sorry.
Thank you very much. I'm Tahira, a King's College London student. Something that was just discussed right at the end and also throughout the discussion was about, higher education. I was wondering if there are any suggestions for tuition fee reform, since I and many other students feel like the debt is quite a lot, and from the conversations I've had with other students, it's putting a lot of different students off of pursuing higher education. And since making sure that our labour force is, has the education and skills required, I was wondering if any tuition fee, reform is suggested or, could be implemented to ensure that, there's better growth and fair growth.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
I'm Cameron Shepherd. While attempting to expand funding for education, reform social care, keep people in work, can we afford to continue funding the NHS under its current mandate, particularly with the gradually sickening, particularly types of diabetes, for instance, and getting older population?
Thank you. That's a very quick, concise question. Thank you very much. And one over here.
Hi, I'm Solomon. I am a student at LSE. My question is, there's been a lot of discussion around local economies and how they function, and less so about how they should be interacting and the geographical mobility between them. I wanted to ask your thoughts about how necessary it is for people to be able to go between these communities, and also interactions between the North and the South in terms of delivering that fair growth.
Thank you very much. That's a really brilliant question. So one on tuition fees, one on can we fund healthcare and the interaction within, or between rather, people able to move between local economies. Rosie, if we start you and head down, what are your thoughts on those three questions? So off you go.
Yeah, so if I just take the NHS question first, so I mean that's definitely a big challenge. I mean, we did some modelling recently which suggests that we're going to need to spend an extra 50 billion a year by 2030 to fund health and social care, basically due to rising costs, ageing population. So, and it is and will crowd out other public services. So we definitely do need reform as well as investment. I don't think you can do one without the other. I don't think you can reform things for free, and I don't think you can just pour money in and hope that everything will get better, because we are a changing society. We do need to change the system, I think. And I actually think Labour kind of have recognised that point. I'm not sure they've recognised that we need to probably spend quite a lot of extra money to get there. But yeah, that's definitely an issue. On the education and tuition fee reform, it's not something that we've looked at specifically. I think in this country, I think we need to think more about business funding of training and education as well. I mean, the proportion of education and training funding by businesses has really gone down. So I think there's a conversation to be had at a societal level about how we kind of rebalance that. And then what was the final question on
about moving between local economies? Should people find it more easy to move between local economies?
I mean, yes, there's many different barriers to that, isn't there? And I think the people who will face the most barriers are probably the people who are least well off and well equipped to start off with. So I think a lot of that starts at home, actually, and starts at the beginning with all the sorts of public services we've been talking about.
Brilliant. And Paul and Hilary, whichever ones you want to pick up on.
So on tuition fees, I'm going to disappoint you. Spending more money on that would not be in my top 20 in terms of priority for a new government. We currently spend 100 times more supporting higher education students than we do further education students. There's no evidence that the current tuition fee regime has reduced the numbers going into higher education. And we do know from Scotland, if you reduce the amount, if you don't have fees and you constrain numbers, then you just reduce the size of the higher education population. If you want to spend more money, it's the upfront support of students' living costs, which is much more important in terms of determining whether they go into higher education. On NHS funding, I think we just have to accept we're going to be spending more on health over time for all sorts of reasons, and it's a mistake to think we won't. The biggest fiscal announcement, arguably, of my lifetime outside of crises was actually this June, when the NHS workforce plan was announced. That will cost 2% of national income by itself in the next 15 years. And in a sense, we just need to accept it. There's no point being rich if we're sick and dead. So, we're going to spend more on it. It's kind of, it's the classic superior good. And on mobility between local areas, yes, there's quite a lot. Essentially, the better educated you are and the better off your background, the more likely you are to move between local areas, and particularly to move to London and the South East if that's not where you started off. But what we do have is dreadful public transport into cities outside of London, which means that people can't access jobs other than those that are very close to where they happen to be. So I think things that both motivate mobility for a broader section of the population so they can access jobs elsewhere, but in particular allow people not just to have to move to London, but to create much bigger labour markets around Manchester and Birmingham and Leeds and elsewhere. And if you compare British cities with American cities, they've got much less good access by road, and if you compare them to European cities, much less good access by public transport, and that is at least one of the reasons why we have this inequality in productivity across the country.
Yes, how fantastic we've got so many students in the audience, can I just say, given that you're going to be the future running all of this. This is completely fantastic. I'm a bit nervous to disagree with Paul because he is actually the economist on the panel, but I think that, you know, all of education needs to move from a kind of expenditure to an investment, and that would mean tuition fees. I think that I'm not sure about, I mean, I presume your data is true that people aren't off-put. I mean, as somebody with a daughter that's just gone to university, I'm absolutely like I hadn't really engaged with it, and now I'm completely flabbergasted. And I think that what I do see is very, very high levels of mental distress in young people who graduate with a lot of debt, and then kind of salaries are kind of not rising, and it's quite difficult. It's quite a difficult decision. I think we need to think about all of education as kind of was thought about in the New Deal coming out of the Second World War, that the more education we have, the better. You know, at that point, they thought that kind of returning veterans would all go and learn to be carpenters or whatever. And people said, no, they wanted to go to Harvard to do law or be accountants and be engineers. And really what happened was that they grew the skills across the whole labour force, not the whole, because there were kind of really egregious kind of race factors in that bill. But largely, they grew kind of the kinds of education that they needed to go into a transition, which is what's happening now. I think that, you know, we are going to have to change our work if we are going to reach net zero. Lots and lots of us are going to have to transition out of one form of work into another. We need a completely different wiring for kind of education that's continually available to do that. Somebody's holding up a thing, so I think I better just make one more point, which would be about local economies. I mean, of course, it is definitely true, you know, that it would be very helpful to be able to kind of move between economies. We know that kind of rail infrastructure and all the rest of it doesn't work. I've just finished a kind of 3-year kind of ethnographic study of kind of good work and work organising in post-industrial places in the UK and the US. The biggest concern actually is in every place that I've been working in that is good work, and local people cannot access that good work in that place. So actually kind of fixing that, which are some of the things we've talked about, as well as I think kind of new forms of institution to bring employers in new ways. I do think kind of local industrialists are really important to this. That's what would be most important within places to start with, so that that work doesn't go to people who are more affluent, who do actually come from outside and are not people from those places that can't access the good work.
Yeah, that's really great. I would say in terms of young people as well, that this government talks a lot about cutting tax, but the truth is, with Sunak's last budget as Chancellor, it was to lower the repayment threshold. It would have been £200 more for every single graduate paying as a tax directly on young people. I think it was pretty shameful.
Can I just say one more thing about this? My kind of ethnic. So the other thing is, I suppose everybody here is aware of this, but when you go to university, you not only take on a loan for the tuition fees, but you take on one for living. And the living is of different costs. So if you're kind of a poor student, you go and live in one place. And if you're a rich student, you go and live in another place. I mean, the whole point of further education is to stick us all in a melting pot, get to know each other, build horizontal relations. I mean, this is a completely bonkers system for building a nation. So it isn't just about whether people can bear it. It's about, like, what is the social glue we need as a nation to kind of move forward and flourish? And kind of choosing your accommodation because you're middle class from London versus somewhere else, that isn't it. And that's what this is doing. Sorry, I just have to say.
I'm okay with you attacking this government. I'm completely fine with this. Brilliant. We've only got about 3.5 minutes left. I've got like a countdown clock here, which is somewhat ominous. So can I take I tell you what, 2 very, very fast questions. There's a woman with blonde hair in the back over there, and then I saw one over here, the more distinguished gentleman on my left here. Thank you.
Hello, I'd just like...
And very quick and concise, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask the question. It seems like the panel are in agreement that investment in public services is essential. So I'm interested in their view on where that new funding or investment should come from. It seems like we have high levels of wealth inequality at the moment, and also one of the greatest decreases in living standards. So yeah, just wondering where they think that extra funding should come from.
Thank you. Over here.
My name's Paul Hodson. I think my question is mainly directed at Paul Johnson. He referred to, I think, welcoming the devolution, in fact, of decision-making to local government authorities. as a result of being on local amenity societies in 2 boroughs, one in the West Midlands and one in South London, I attended various meetings of local planning committees. My impression was that 50% of the councillors, in fact, on the planning committee hadn't the first clue as to what was going on. In fact, they didn't do their homework. And also, it seemed to me that in many cases, the local government officers who were advising the councillors didn't have much more clue than the councillors whom they were advising. So I'm a bit sceptical about his welcoming of this devolution.
There we go. Thank you very much. So 1 minute, 40 seconds left. Investment and scepticism about devolution and skills of governance. Who'd like to go first?
Well, what I will say is that 80% of the cost in any public service in Britain today is bureaucratic. It's about assessing, referring, managing, passing the parcel. And we've got really, really good examples now, really, with good data, with good population numbers, to show that when you design services not like that, assess me, refer me, manage me, there is money in the system. What's happened in the last decade is that we no longer have money to begin to kind of oil the system, to kind of shift the system. So everything is kind of ground to a halt. But I mean, there are just by my book, there are just so many examples of this. We just can't have this conversation anymore that it's about money. It's not about money. It's about the model of public services that we're working with, which was designed to get us into a kind of oil-based carbon industrial economy, and we're not there anymore.
Buy my book too.
Buy his book too.
Look, if we're going to...
We've got the same publicist. She's going to be delighted. I hope somebody's videoing it.
In terms of raising money, in the end, if a new government is serious about really improving public service, and particularly about health, then more money will need to be raised. And that's tough, given where we are in terms of the level of taxes at the moment. And you've got the choice. The sorts of things that we've heard Labour talking about at the moment, VAT on private schools, non-DOMs and so on, are small amounts of money, and they're not going to touch the sides, really. So you need to look at the big taxes, national insurance, VAT, income tax. That's where the serious money is, I'm afraid. We already raise more from corporation tax than most countries. We already raise more from high-income people than most countries. You can get a bit more from that. But you can't look at someone else to pay. If we're serious about getting an extra 30 billion of tax revenue, I'm afraid that will mostly come, or that will hit people on average incomes, and we have to be clear about that.
Cool. And Rosie, the final word.
So I think in terms of where the funding should come from, I think the tax system does need reforming. And I think where we would start is reforming and abolishing quite a lot of tax reliefs. We think you could raise about 8 billion that way. That's still relatively small fry, but it's quite significant still. We also think we should be equalising capital gains and income tax, so income from assets and income from work should be taxed the same. But then, Paul is right, the spending asks are big, and as we go on, we will have to consider the big hitters, income tax, basically. But I think we should also be thinking about wealth taxes as well. And I think a net wealth tax should be on the table, even if it's not necessarily the most easily doable or politically salient. And just quickly on local government, I think it's important to remember that local government budgets have been hit one of the hardest over the last 13 years. So there's been a lot of capacity stripped out of local government. So, it's amazing that places are doing what they're doing despite that, but it's perhaps also not surprising if there are capacity issues, and that capacity building and proper funding really has to be part of any devolution deal.
That's really helpful. As a final word, local government, we should also remember that councillors do this on top of their day jobs. There's a huge amount of work, investment and resource. So for the politicians out there, a bit of sympathy. And on that closing note, thank you so much for this panel. Obviously buy Hillary's and Paul's book. Rosie and I will write one soon. Buy that too. And otherwise, hope you guys have a wonderful lunch and afternoon. Thank you very much. Round of applause, please.